Michael Beschloss is the author of 9 books on presidential history, including most recently the New York Times bestseller, Presidential Courage and the Conquerors. He is an NBC News Presidential Historian and a PBS NewsHour contributor, and has received an Emmy and 6 honorary degrees. Michael, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Quinn, and thank you for all you're doing.
In your view, why is it important for people with disabilities to vote, especially young people?
Well, here we live in a society where the vote means so much, and this is true of anyone. It's particularly true of people with disabilities. If you do not vote, your fate is going to be determined by people who are elected by people who may not share your values and your interests. The rich people can hire lobbyists to affect what the government does. Greedy people will make sure that they vote and that they get involved in what the government does. Same thing with people who have all sorts of ability to operate in this system. So if you've got a system like that and people who have disabilities and people who care about people with disabilities, if they don't vote, we will be living in a system that has a tyranny of people who do not care about this.
About 60 million people in this country with disabilities, and that's also one for every household almost.
Right.
And people who take care of them. And if they all went to go vote, they themselves alone could change an entire outcome of an election.
One mark of a society is how well it takes care and advances those with disabilities. And one way that measures how well the society takes care of that is how many people vote and what they care about and how they express themselves and how the government reacts.
Michael, you're a historian. What can history teach us about the power of voting?
Well, historically, Quinn, going back to the time of the founding, including some of your ancestors, the people who founded this country felt that probably the most important right of all that an American could have would be to vote. Because if you've got the vote, then you can decide on just about everything that happens in the society. And people, for instance, who hated Black people, who did not take women seriously, who wanted to marginalize other groups, that's why they worked so hard to deny the vote to women and to African Americans and others. So this voting right is so important and so central. If we do not use it, we're turning our backs on what the founders intended. So if you look at American history, what it's the story of is expanding rights for everyone, and especially the vote, because the founders and the rest of us know how important that is. And that's why in 2020, anyone who cares about people with disabilities has to get to the polls and vote or send a mail-in ballot.
What would you say to young and first-time voters with disabilities to encourage them to go vote?
Make sure you do it early if you can. Make sure you've got a plan, and make sure, like me, that you've got help from people who are better at this than I am.
I always think about my dad back in those days when he got polio.
I was just thinking of him.
Yeah, and even though he was never in a paraplegic, and I think he was too young to vote at that time. I think he was only 16.
Right.
But it would have been amazing for somebody like my dad in that position to be able, who is of age, to have a mail-in ballot to vote.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also, even above and beyond voting, your dad, who, as you know, I knew extremely well, had such spirit and had such a robust constitution that he was a little bit like FDR, that even when he got sick, he didn't say, well, no more sports for me, and I'd better find some profession where I don't need to move around very much. He lived his life, and he was a war hero, as you know, in World War II. And, that's just a life that everyone should emulate.
What is your plan, and why is it important to have a plan before you go vote?
By coincidence, I got my ballot yesterday, so it makes it a little bit easier for me. But what I'm worried about is people in other places in the country where, there's not such a history of mail-in voting. There may be voter suppression where people try to obstruct those who have a difficult time voting because of disabilities or other challenges thinking that they may stand for something politically that these forces do not represent. So all I'm saying is, this is one of the most important elections in American history. I think it may be the most important election in American history. But if you can, just think in advance of all the things that might happen and how you can make sure that your vote is counted despite all of that.
Michael, being a historian, how do you think history will look back on this very moment that we're living in now?
I think that history will look back on this moment as one of the very few times in history where democracy was on the ballot. In his inaugural address, President Kennedy, whom your father knew extremely well, your dad was one of John Kennedy's best friends, and he was one of his best friends at the time that Kennedy became president on inaugural day. And on inaugural day, Kennedy said, in the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the privilege of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I would say that describes 2020 very well.
Michael, what's next for you in the future?
Well, actually, I'm writing a book on 20th century presidents. As you know, I've done this. All I've done is write 10 books over the last number of decades. So I wish I could tell you I was joining the circus or something, but one more book that's on 20th century presidents and equal justice. And what it's about is sort of what we're talking about, which is, presidents were elected to office oftentimes by people who were, all male or all white or both. And therefore the presidents elected didn't care as much about, Black rights in this country as they should have. And so it is largely, not all, but largely a happy story through the 20th century of how this country went from 1900, where it was segregated and Black people couldn't vote and women couldn't vote, to the year 2000, where we were not anywhere near perfect, but the system had gotten us very far along and we were living in a much nicer place.
Michael, thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate you being here with me today.
Loved it as always, Quinn, and once again, thank you for everything you are doing. Please keep it up. We need it.